Hello and welcome to another edition of the Campus Talks. I'm Mel Wildermuth, and with me is Croft Edwards. And he is an author, leadership coach, leadership flow expert, keynote speaker, president of Croft and Company. So you have several titles there that you deal with.
I do.
So let's look at some of the questions that we'd like to ask you today. And first of all, you have a saying that's on your LinkedIn page. So how has your saying about change on your LinkedIn page established the way you approach leadership, training, and coaching?
So the thing about change, it's the challenge that we want the benefits of change, but we don't want to actually change ourselves. And so I've always felt like the most difficult person I've ever had to lead is me. And if I can get me out of the way, other people are relatively easy. But I've got my biases, my assessments, my quirks, my issues. So if I want to change, I've got to learn how to motivate myself within that context.
Okay. And how does that impact, what do you mean by leadership flow?
So leadership flow, kind of backtrack a little bit. I've been on a study of leadership since I was about 8 years old. I read Omar Bradley's 700-page autobiography called A Soldier's Story. And it really just piqued this question in me: why was Bradley effective as a leader and not other people? And so it's been a question I've kind of been exploring. And so leadership flow is my methodology. And I look at leadership from leadership aspect, which is based a lot on what's called ontological coaching. But some of the distinctions, one of the distinctions we make in that field is that leadership is the authority granted to an individual by their followers. So to be a leader, I have to have somebody say, I see in you a future that I want to be a part of. And then flow is the study of ultimate performance that has been brought to the forefront by specifically Mihai Csikszentmihalyi with his research of flow in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then Stephen Kotler and the Flow Genome Project and others. But flow is that state of ultimate performance where we're at our best and we perform at our best. And so for me, leadership flow was going, what if the real point of leadership is not results, but it's finding flow in my followers. It's bringing people so alive that they themselves show up as their best, which brings out the best, and the results are actually the byproduct. So leadership flow is how you get people at their best.
So how does leadership flow impact engagement?
Well, that's what it's about, engagement. So I can show up, the other side of the coin for our definition, management is the authority granted to an individual by the organization. So I can show up as a boss and I can say, Mel, you're going to be here from 8 to 5 and you're going to make widgets and you're going to do it because I told you so. And if not, I'm going to fire you, right? That's not likely going to bring out the best in Mel, right?
Yes.
But what if I can show up and say, first of all, Mel, we're going to create a job or an environment or something that you're committed to, that you want to be a part of. So instead of you showing up 8 to 5, you show up at 7 one morning because you have stuff you want to do. So it's tapping in the inherent greatness of each individual. But to do that, I as a leader have to get me out of the way, and I have to show up as an offer to people where they say, yes, I want to follow you because in you I see a future that's being taken care of.
So some of this seems to be in a theoretical aspect, but you say on your website, I think, that approaches of leadership that you do as training as a practitioner rather than a theorist. So how do you balance those two aspects?
So a lot of what we do is how do you actually practice leadership? Not theoretical. We're going to go talk about what a leader does. We're going to actually go start having conversations. So we can look at, for instance, a speech act. So you can break language down into fundamentally about 6 things. One of them, for instance, is making a request. So leaders make very effective requests, but language, it's not just the language, it's the moods and emotions we do the request in and the body in which we show up in. So if I show up in a body that's very determined and Mel, will you help me with this? That's not a very effective request.
Yeah.
Whereas, hey, Mel, can we have a conversation about something I need some help with. I want to see if I could get your buy-in on it, right? So it's behaviors we can practice, and we do that through what we call leadership flow dojos. So instead of more traditional, hey, I'm going to pontificate for the next 8 hours on what leadership is, we're going to actually start practicing having conversations. And we're going to start doing things with our bodies. Like, for instance, how do I show up as open? How do I show up in a physical state which allows different conversations? So it's all based on, basically the premise of ontological coaching is the intersection of body, moods and emotions, and language, and how we show up.
So, in other words, studying aspects of maybe neuroscience as well as the actual nonverbal cues that your body gives out, that would be a part of your training as well?
Yeah, so we would actually, so you could practice, so we could sit and you and I could have a conversation, but there are things I can start to practice, like I need to learn how to be open. And it's I'm making it sound somewhat simple, but there can be a lot of practice involved. But if I'm good at having an open conversation, it's because I've practiced it.
Okay.
Now, if I'm good at it, chances are that's been my default. That's the conversation I practice. If I want to get good at something, I've just got to practice. So leadership is a skill like golf, like football, like knitting that can be learned, if we know how to break it down and start practicing what we need to practice.
So what is the most difficult aspect of that leaders have difficulty learning?
Well, it's unique for each person.
Okay.
But as a general rule, one of the things I always tell people, it's funny, in organizations, moods and emotions are generally taboo, right?
Okay.
Unless they're the good ones. We want the good ones. So Mel, we want you to be motivated and we want you to do all the right things. But what happens if Mel's frustrated, right? Moods and emotions are a predisposition to action, right? If you think of the word emotion, to put into motion. So if I have a mood of resentment, the action I fundamentally want to take is to get even with somebody.
Yeah, okay.
So I've got to learn how to let go of that. And each person is unique and different. So the practices that you might need to do may be very different than the practices I may need to do. And so it's the starting of conversations around, okay, where do I need to practice? How do I need to practice? And one of the ways we start, for instance, in the body is with the practice of centering.
Okay.
So centering is that place of choice in the body. Okay. So if I'm centered, now I have all options available to me. But for most people, I'm not centered. I'm in a certain body disposition, which is already opening some doors and closing others, right? So for instance, if I was open, there's some advantages, obviously, to being open. Let's try new ideas. The problem is, if I always show up as open as a leader, the situation may call for me not to be open, but very resolute.
Okay.
I'm going to have to step up and get focused and focus my energy. So these are all practices, and it's sometimes it's difficult to share in a conversation how to do it, because the only way you can really learn it is to practice it.
We have a question on the Leader Campus from a Dinah Maloney, and she asks about fear. How does fear play into this with your trainees?
Well, so one of the things we could explore is, first of all, what is fear, right? How does that show up in your body, right? And generally with fear, what it is we want to physically get away from something which we have an assessment is going to harm us. So my body is going to show up more as contracting, pulling away from. So a lot of times, if we're going to practice something like that, and again, the individual situation would determine how we approach it. But in some format, the person is going to have to learn how to face whatever it is they fear.
Okay.
And so that's a practice that I can do. And a lot of times, for instance, if we fear stuff, there's a pattern. In these situations, I fear these kind of things. But ultimately, what's happening is my body is doing something which is now protecting itself. And so if I want to practice dealing with fear, a way to practice that is learning how to accept whatever the situation is and then choosing how would I like to face the situation. And so that's a way we might do that.
This sounds as though it would be better served as a coaching kind of a technique than a large group training. Do you have problems converting this into a large group training program?
No, because usually we practice kind of basic stuff to begin with. But then in the context of practicing something, everybody's practicing how it shows up for them. And then generally when we work with organizations, there's a lot of coaching anyway.
Okay.
So a lot of individual coaching, because each person is unique. Each person shows up as a different shape.
Okay. What do you think is the one thing or one aspect that you teach that expands a person's leadership capacity?
I would say that the place we always start is the premise that the most difficult person you're ever going to have to lead is yourself.
Okay.
And so it's that self-awareness piece. And most leaders, my assessment is most leaders, they struggle with themselves. I have assessments of what I think things should be. I have a body that's not open to certain conversations. And so if I can't coach myself and lead myself to have those conversations, I can't have the conversations. And so generally where we focus is your biggest challenge is you.
Huh. What you've done training in several different industries. Yeah. Do you find that the different leaderships in different industries have more of a cohesive problem around that industry versus another industry?
No, my sense is, each industry has their way of observing certain things. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I spent a lot of time in the mining industries. And I've spent time at mines where the day before people were killed.
Oh, gee.
And so what happens is we develop a culture, which is how we deal with things. And so each organization is unique. Each organization and industry is unique. But ultimately, the higher performing organizations have very effective conversations. And just because my conversation works in my industry doesn't mean it'll work in a different one. So it's the one commonality is we're all humans trying to coordinate action through conversation.
Okay. But languages are quite different from several industries at all. Does that have an impact then on the way people approach their conversations, since they have their own what would I say, their own way of expressing things, I guess, or syntax?
Yeah, and it also limits what conversations are possible.
Okay.
So for instance, I had a client that was a mine that showing perceived weakness through emotion was not acceptable.
Oh, gee.
And so what that did was that allowed certain things to happen, and it also limited other things that could not happen. And so this organization, the one I'm thinking about, the mine leader kind of ruled with an iron fist. And because of that, there were very limited possibilities for that organization because he was not physically capable of having different conversations. So that can happen regardless of the industry. It's fundamentally, we can only have the conversations that were physiologically available to happen.
Okay. What about the structure of the company or corporation? Is there more problems in a well, I wouldn't say hierarchical, but more steps between the bottom and the top, or the more flat organization? Is there a difference in that type of style?
So, yes, definitely. And again, though, it comes down to how effective do we have conversations.
Okay.
So just because I'm more hierarchical isn't necessarily better or worse. At the end of the day, we're still trying to have conversations. So, but think about an organizational structure is actually a conversation.
Okay.
That we've said, okay, here's how we're going to have conversations. And then if it's hierarchical, we're going to have to get a message or data from point A to point B, you've got to go through 6 levels. That's a conversation. that set up that structure, because we could just as easily say we're going to take out that structure. So it's the conversations that we're creating organizations with. And that's where a lot of organizations struggle, because they perceive this is the way things are. Yeah, because you haven't had different conversations to say, let's change it.
So you said that going back to pretty much the first thing you were talking about is that Bradley, right, is the one that had the influence on you with the book. But Bradley was in the military, and of course that's a top-down organization. You're sounding like there's a difference. You're approaching a different situation than what the military usually is.
Well, the irony is I'm a 24-year veteran of the U.S. Army.
Oh, gee.
So I have that experience. But Bradley was a very different leader than Pat.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely.
But in the structure, right? In the structure, it was the effectiveness of the conversation. One of the reasons I would surmise the Allies were effective was Eisenhower was the supreme commander looking just at Europe. He had very effective conversations.
Uh-huh.
Right? And so the structure, every structure is going to be different, but at the end of the day, a structure itself is a conversation, because leaders can just as easily say, we're going to change the structure.
Okay. Right?
By the definition of a leader, I can change my organizational structure. I could say, we're going to have different conversations. A way I look at it, and this is not getting into politics, but just pick a politician, any politician. And so whether you like Donald Trump or not isn't the point. Donald Trump is having different conversations than Obama had.
Yeah.
And for some people, that is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Other people, it's the end of the world. And when Obama was in charge, it was the end of the world versus greatest thing since sliced bread. They just have different conversations. And so what I tend to look at is not, do I like A or B, but rather, is the conversation creating flow in the organization? Okay. Are people showing up at their best, or are they showing up in a sense as frustrated moods and emotions that we're just 8 in the gate? We show up, we put our work in.
So if I'm catching this correctly as well, it's almost like a river or something of that nature, because a river, when it meanders, will do cutting in different areas and sooner or later change the position. If an organization is in an industry that changes, they need to change that flow and change the conversation.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. I mean, at the end of the day, if we look at using the river, the water is going to get to the sea. Mm-hmm. And it's going to find the path which is the most efficient, most effective, blah, blah, blah. Well, organizations, if they really start to explore this, their goal is to find success, whatever success is. But many times they get in their own way. You know, think of, for instance, Kodak. The inability to change. 30 years ago, Kodak was as big of a brand as you could have, and now I don't even know if they exist. Mm-hmm. Could they have different conversations? I do know that Kodak had the opportunity to have conversations about digital photography and chose not to.
Okay. Well, I really think that this is a fascinating conversation. I appreciate it myself. Thanks so much. And at the end of the interviews, I always give a chance. Oh, well, I have one last question. That my wife says that we need to ask, and that is the thoughts on authentic leadership and its current influence on leadership training.
Authenticity is wow, that's a deep subject. But my assessment is that when people show up as authentic is when we find flow.
Okay.
And so that, in a sense, is part of the conversation. How can we find authenticity so that people can be at their best? When people having coached for almost 20 years, my assessment is when people struggle with being authentic, they tend to not be at their best. In fact, I would say all the time they're not at their best because they're not authentic. Mm-hmm. So to find flow, to bring out the best of people, we have to let people find that authenticity. The challenge is, though, my authenticity could offend this person or vice versa. So it's hard. It's a hard thing to do in an organization, but ultimately we do that through conversations.
Okay. So I thank you again for the time that you spent with us. And is there something that you would like to plug? Because I give the opportunity for people to plug something here as a part of the reward for the interview.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, so you can learn more about us at croftandcompany.com. Just published a book called Leadership Flow Perfectly Square, a story about learning to lead and transforming a company, which Leadership Flow, obviously my methodology, Perfectly Square is the name of the business in the story. And that can be found at Leadership Flow, the book. And follow me on Twitter at Croft Edwards or LinkedIn at Croft Edwards.
Okay. Thank you very much, Croft. I appreciate the time, and I hope everything goes well.
Thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.